to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health.
On a Tuesday morning in March, 9 men walked into a conference room on the 42nd floor of an office building in Charlotte, North Carolina, expecting to close the single largest deal of their careers. They had spent 4 months negotiating. Every page had been reviewed by lawyers on both sides. All that remained, on that Tuesday morning, was a signature. And then the doors opened, and the woman who walked in to join that meeting was about to take a quiet but permanent piece of one of those men's lives back from him. And not a single person sitting at that table had any idea who she actually was. Why would they? 9 years earlier, that same woman had stood on the porch of a small house in rural Tennessee, 7 months pregnant, holding one suitcase, while the man on the other side of the closed door in front of her explained, calmly, that she and the children she was carrying were no longer something he needed to think about. Her name is Rachel Whitmore. And what happened in the 9 years between that porch and that boardroom is not really a story about revenge, even though, by the end of it, you may find it very hard to call it anything else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to where this story actually begins. Rachel Whitmore was born in 1987 in a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, the only child of a single mother named Carol Whitmore, who worked double shifts as a nurse's aide for most of Rachel's childhood and who had, by the time Rachel was old enough to ask questions about it, no contact at all with her own parents, for reasons she never fully explained and Rachel eventually stopped asking about. There was no extended family in any meaningful sense. No grandparents who visited on weekends, no aunts or uncles who showed up at school events. Nothing of the kind of safety net that a lot of people grow up simply assuming exists somewhere in the background of their lives, even if they never have to use it. Rachel grew up understanding, early and without anyone having to explain it to her directly, that whatever she was going to end up with in life was going to be something she built herself, because there was nobody standing behind her who was going to build it for her. She was, by every account from people who knew her as a child, an unusually serious kid. Quiet in groups, the kind of child who teachers describe as well-behaved without quite knowing what else to say about her, but sharp, noticeably sharp, when it came to anything involving numbers. She started working part-time jobs at 15, first bagging groceries at a small local market, and then, a year later, doing basic filing and data entry at a small accounting office in town, owned and operated by a man named Frank Dillard, who had been doing taxes and bookkeeping for local families and small businesses in that part of Tennessee for nearly 30 years. Frank noticed something in Rachel almost immediately. Something that had less to do with raw talent and more to do with attention. The way she would look at a column of numbers that didn't balance and simply keep looking at it, quietly, until she found where the error was, rather than asking someone else to find it for her. He started letting her shadow him on basic bookkeeping work after school, and by the time Rachel graduated high school in 2005, she had something most of her classmates didn't have. Not money. Knowledge. A real, working understanding of how small businesses actually functioned, how money moved through them, what made the difference between a business that survived and one that didn't. Rachel enrolled in community college that fall, studying business administration part-time, continuing to work for Frank in the afternoons and on weekends. Then, in the spring of 2008, when Rachel was 21 years old, her mother died suddenly, of a heart attack, with no warning at all. Carol Whitmore was 46. Rachel was, from that point forward, in the most literal sense possible, completely alone in the world. About 40 minutes away, in a different part of the same county, a young man named Gregory Hale was growing up in circumstances that could not have been more different. Gregory's father, Donald Hale, ran a construction and contracting company that had been built up slowly over 2 decades, doing residential developments and small commercial projects throughout the region, the kind of business that never shows up in any newspaper, but that, over enough years, quietly becomes worth a considerable amount of money. Gregory was the older of two sons, and from a fairly early age, it was simply understood by his father, by people in the community, and by Gregory himself, that Gregory would eventually take over Hale Construction. He worked for his father throughout his 20s, learning the business from the ground up the way his father had, and by 2010, at 26 years old, Gregory was already being introduced to the company's clients and business partners as, in his father's words, the future of Hale Construction. What almost nobody outside Gregory's immediate family circle knew, in early 2010, was that Gregory was also, at that time, already privately engaged. The young woman's name was Diane Pruitt, and she was the daughter of one of Donald Hale's longest-standing business partners. The engagement had not been publicly announced. Both families, for reasons that had considerably more to do with the long-term business relationship between the two families than with anything resembling romance, considered the match an excellent one, and had, in fact, been quietly anticipating it for some time before it was ever formally agreed upon. Rachel met Gregory in early 2010 at Frank Dillard's accounting office. Hale Construction was one of Frank's clients, a relatively small account at the time, mostly basic bookkeeping and seasonal tax preparation, and Gregory would occasionally come in himself to drop off paperwork or pick up documents on behalf of his father's company. Their relationship developed slowly, over several months, in the kind of low-key, almost incidental way that doesn't look like much of anything from the outside while it's happening. Coffee, sometimes, after Rachel finished work for the day. Conversations that, more often than not, ended up being about business, about numbers, about exactly the kinds of things Rachel actually understood well and rarely had anyone to talk to about. Gregory, by Rachel's own later description of him, had a quality that felt, at the time, like genuine warmth, the kind of presence that made whoever he was talking to feel like the only person in the room, without him ever seeming to be working particularly hard to create that impression. What Rachel did not know, during any of this, was that the entire time, Gregory's engagement to Diane Pruitt was already a settled fact, already agreed upon by both families, simply not yet publicly announced. Gregory had made, at some point fairly early in his relationship with Rachel, a decision not to mention it. By the fall of 2010, Rachel was pregnant, with twins. Rachel told Gregory in November of 2010 at a small diner about 20 minutes from where the two of them had first met. She had rehearsed the conversation, by her own later account, more times than she could count in the days leading up to it, not because she expected Gregory to react badly, but because she genuinely believed, at the time, that he was going to be happy. Surprised, certainly, but happy. His reaction, as Rachel described it years later to one of the very few people she ever told this story to in full, was immediate, and it was visible, in a way that she found impossible to forget. A kind of stillness that came over his face, a stillness she would later describe, very simply, as the moment his face stopped being the face she knew. He didn't say much that day. He told her he needed time to think about it. And then, for the better part of 2 weeks, Gregory Hale did not return a single one of Rachel's phone calls. When he finally did respond, it wasn't with a call. It came through a message, passed along through a mutual acquaintance, asking Rachel to come out to a smaller house on his family's property. Not the main house where Donald and Gregory's mother lived, but a separate, smaller house on the same land where Gregory had been staying on his own, on a Saturday afternoon in early December. Rachel arrived at that house on December 4th, 2010. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was carrying a single suitcase, because by that point, she had already lost the small apartment she had been renting on her own, unable to keep up with the rent after her hours at Frank's office had been quietly reduced over the previous several weeks, for reasons nobody had explained to her, and that she hadn't had the energy to ask about. What happened next, Rachel has described, consistently, over many years, to the small number of people she eventually told. Gregory did not come outside to meet her. He spoke to her through the door of that house, a door that Rachel would later clarify was not locked, simply closed, with Gregory standing on the other side of it the entire time the two of them spoke. He told her that he was engaged, that this had been decided for a long time, well before he had ever met her, and that whatever was happening with the pregnancy was, in the words he used, not something he could be involved with right now. Rachel asked him, standing on that porch, speaking through that closed door, what she was supposed to do. And Gregory's answer, the exact words, became, in Rachel's mind, over the following 9 years, the single sentence that everything else in this story would eventually be measured against. He said, "That's not really my problem anymore." Rachel stood on that porch for several minutes after Gregory stopped speaking. She did not knock again. She did not raise her voice or call out. She picked up her suitcase, walked back down the long gravel driveway that led from that house to the main road, and called the only person in the world she could think of who might help her. Frank Dillard. Retired by that point for nearly 2 years, Frank drove out to meet her that same afternoon and brought her back to his own home, where Rachel would end up staying, in a spare bedroom that had belonged to no one in particular for years, for the following several months. 3 months later, in March of 2011, Rachel gave birth to twin boys. And 6 weeks after that, while Rachel was still recovering, still living in Frank Dillard's spare room, still trying to work out how she was going to support 2 infants with no job, no income, and no family of any kind to turn to, Gregory Hale married Diane Pruitt. In a wedding that Hale Construction's small internal company newsletter described that spring as a wonderful new chapter for the Hale family. Rachel saw the announcement. Someone at Frank's old office had a subscription to the newsletter and mentioned it, not unkindly, simply as local news. Rachel asked to see it, and then she kept it. She would, in fact, keep that single page from that newsletter for the next 9 years. For the first 2 years after her sons were born, Rachel's life looked, from the outside, like the life of a great many young single mothers in similar circumstances. She worked part-time, whatever she could find that fit around caring for infant twins with no childcare support beyond Frank, who was by then in his early 70s and doing more than anyone could reasonably have asked of him already. But Frank did something else during those years, something that, looking back, turned out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. Even in retirement, Frank still did basic bookkeeping for a handful of small local businesses, mostly as a favor to clients he'd had for decades. And as Rachel's sons got just old enough that she had small windows of time during the day, she started helping Frank again, not as an employee exactly, not anymore, but as something closer to a quiet, informal partner, even though neither of them ever used that word out loud. In 2013, when her sons were 2 years old, Rachel made a decision that, to almost everyone who knew anything about her situation at the time, looked like an enormous risk for someone in her position to be taking. She enrolled, full-time, in an online accounting degree program through a state university, the kind of program specifically designed for working adults, structured so that most of the coursework could be completed at night, after her sons were asleep. It took her 4 years. 4 years of working during the day in whatever capacity she could, caring for 2 young children essentially alone, and studying at night, with almost no margin in her schedule for anything else at all. She graduated in 2017 at 30 years old, with a bachelor's degree in accounting and with a depth of real, hands-on bookkeeping experience, built up over more than a decade working alongside Frank, that made her, on paper, considerably more employable than her age or her background might otherwise have suggested to anyone reviewing her resume. What almost nobody knew, including, for a long time, Frank himself, was that throughout those same years, Rachel had also been doing something else, quietly, on the side. She had been paying attention to Hale Construction. This was not obsession, not in the way that word usually gets used when people tell stories like this one. Rachel did not follow Gregory Hale's personal life. She did not track his marriage to Diane, or whatever children they may have had together, or any detail at all about who Gregory had become as a person in the years since that afternoon on the porch. What Rachel paid attention to, carefully, the way an accountant pays attention to anything, was the business itself. Hale Construction was a regional company, and like a great many regional companies, certain basic categories of information about it were a matter of public record. Permits filed with the county, properties acquired, and, on the occasions when the company took on larger projects than it had in the past, financing arrangements involving local banks, which, depending on how they were structured, would sometimes surface in records that Rachel, because of her training, knew exactly how to locate and how to read. By 2017, the same year Rachel graduated, Hale Construction had grown considerably. Gregory had taken over full leadership of the company from his father 2 years earlier, in 2015, and under his leadership, the company had expanded fairly aggressively into a category of development that required significantly more outside financing than anything Hale Construction had taken on before. Rachel, reading the exact same public records that anyone with the patience to look for them could have read, understood something about the structure of that financing that, as far as she could tell, almost nobody looking at those same records from the outside seemed to have noticed. Hale Construction was growing quickly, and the way it was financing that growth meant that, at some point in the coming years, the company was very likely going to need a considerably larger capital partner than any local bank could provide. Rachel got her first job out of college later that same year, in 2017, at a regional investment firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, a firm that specialized, among other things, in exactly the kind of mid-market capital partnerships that companies like Hale Construction eventually find they need. Rachel was good at her job, genuinely and demonstrably good, for reasons that, at this point in the story, had nothing to do with Gregory Hale at all. The same combination of patience and precision that had carried her through 4 years of night classes while raising 2 children largely on her own translated, almost perfectly, into the kind of detailed, unglamorous analytical work that mid-market investment review actually requires. By 2019, 2 years into the job, Rachel had been promoted twice and was working as a senior associate on her firm's middle-market deal team, the team responsible for evaluating potential investments in exactly the kind of regional companies Hale Construction had become. In late 2019, Hale Construction came across Rachel's desk, not because she sought it out, and not because anyone at her firm had any idea of any connection between her and the company. By that point, Hale Construction's existing financing arrangements had become unsustainable in exactly the way Rachel had quietly anticipated 2 years earlier, and the company had begun, discreetly, looking for a larger capital partner. Rachel's firm was one of several firms approached by Hale Construction's financial advisors. Rachel was assigned to the deal team, not as the lead analyst. She was still relatively junior for that, but as one of 3 associates responsible for the detailed financial review of the company. What Rachel found, over the following months, reviewing Hale Construction's books in real detail for the first time in her life, was a company whose growth had, in several specific and identifiable ways, outpaced its actual financial controls. Nothing illegal, nothing that would ever rise to the level of fraud or anything close to it. Simply a company that had grown faster than its internal financial structures had kept up with, leaving it in a position considerably more precarious than its own leadership appeared to fully understand. This put Rachel's firm in an unusually strong negotiating position. Hale Construction needed this deal, needed it more than its leadership had perhaps initially let on, and Rachel, more than anyone else on the deal team, understood precisely how much leverage that gave her firm. She said nothing to anyone about her own history with this company, not to her colleagues. not to her supervisors. As far as anyone at her firm was aware, Rachel Whitmore was simply an unusually sharp associate who had done unusually thorough work on a deal that happened to involve a company from the part of Tennessee she had grown up in, a detail that, if it ever came up at all, was treated as nothing more than a minor coincidence. The negotiations concluded in early 2020. The terms, by every account from people involved on both sides, were significantly more favorable to Rachel's firm than Hale Construction's side had originally expected going into the process, though not in any way that anyone involved considered unusual or improper. Simply terms that reflected, very precisely, an accurate understanding of exactly how much leverage each side actually held, an understanding that, on Rachel's firm's side of the table, turned out to be considerably more accurate than anyone had any particular reason to expect. The final closing meeting was scheduled for March of 2020 in Charlotte at the offices of Rachel's firm. Hale Construction's side would be represented by its senior leadership, including, for the first time in the entire process, Gregory Hale himself, who had not been personally present for any of the earlier rounds of negotiation, and who was attending this meeting, by every account, simply because closing meetings of this size were the kind of thing a company's chief executive was expected to attend in person. Rachel's supervisor asked her to be in the room, not to lead anything, but as part of the broader team, given how much of the underlying analytical work had ultimately been hers. 9 years, almost to the month, after Rachel and Whitmore had stood on a porch in Tennessee holding a single suitcase, while Gregory Hale spoke to her through a closed door, the two of them sat across the same conference table from each other, in a glass-walled room on the 42nd floor of an office building in Charlotte, North Carolina. Gregory did not recognize her. Not immediately. Rachel was introduced, along with the rest of the deal team, by her title and her firm's name, nothing more. She shook his hand, the way she shook everyone's hand that morning, and said, by every account from people present, almost nothing else during the meeting itself, exactly as she had throughout the entire process leading up to it. It was near the end of the meeting, during a brief pause while final paperwork was being assembled, that Gregory looked at Rachel again, longer this time, and according to one person who was in the room that morning, something in his expression began to change, slowly, in a way that suggested recognition arriving not all at once, but in pieces, the way a name comes back to you when you've been trying not to remember it for a very long time. According to the one account that exists of what happened in the next several seconds, an account from someone who was in the room and who Rachel later spoke to directly about it, Gregory said her name, quietly, almost as a question. Rachel. Rachel looked up from the papers in front of her, met his eyes directly, and said, simply, Mr. Hale. Nothing else. No acknowledgement of anything beyond the entirely professional context the two of them were sitting in. The meeting concluded normally. Documents were signed. The deal closed exactly as it had been negotiated, a deal that gave Rachel's firm a significant ownership stake in Hale Construction, and gave Hale Construction the capital partnership it had, by that point, genuinely needed in order to stabilize. As the room began to empty, Gregory, according to this same account, lingered, clearly intending to say something to Rachel privately, away from everyone else. Rachel, for her part, gathered her papers, offered a brief and entirely professional goodbye to the room generally, and left, without giving Gregory the moment he appeared to be waiting for. Here is the detail that, more than anything else, makes this story what it actually is, and it has very little to do with revenge, at least not in the way that word usually gets used. Rachel did not engineer this deal. She did not manipulate its terms out of any motive connected to Gregory personally. Everything she did, from the day she started at her firm in 2017 to the morning that deal closed in 2020, was simply Rachel doing her job, extremely well, with a depth of background knowledge that happened to be informed by years of quietly paying attention, but nothing that crossed any professional line, then or at any point since. What Rachel was actually holding, walking out of that boardroom that morning, wasn't power over Gregory Hale specifically. It was something considerably larger than that, and considerably quieter. She was holding a career she had built, entirely on her own, over 9 years, starting from a porch in rural Tennessee with a single suitcase, 2 infant sons, and exactly one person in the world willing to help her, a retired accountant who had simply decided, years earlier, that she was worth teaching. By 2020, Rachel had a stable, well-paying position at a respected firm. She owned a small house, not a large one, but hers entirely, with no one else's name on the deed and no debt attached to anyone but herself. Her sons, 9 years old by then, had grown up knowing only a mother who worked hard during the day, studied at night for years on end, and came home, every single evening without exception, to make them dinner. Gregory Hale, meanwhile, now found himself running a company that had just given up a meaningful ownership stake to a firm where, as it happened, the mother of 2 children he had never met, never supported, and never once acknowledged in 9 years, now worked, in a role that would very likely involve some degree of ongoing financial oversight of his company for years to come. Rachel never told anyone at her firm the full story, and as far as her colleagues know to this day, she is simply a talented associate who happened to work on a deal involving a company from the part of Tennessee where she grew up. Gregory Hale, for his part, has never publicly said anything about any of this either, and there is no indication that Diane, or anyone else in Gregory's life, has ever known the full history at all. What this story leaves you with, in the end, isn't really a story about revenge, even though it's tempting, by this point, to want to call it that. Rachel never confronted Gregory, never told anyone what he said to her through that door. What she did instead, for 9 years, was simply build something, slowly, quietly, with no audience and no guarantee it would ever lead anywhere in particular, until one ordinary Tuesday morning, without either of them planning it, the thing she had built and the life he had built happened to end up sitting across the same table from each other, and only one of them, at first, understood what that actually meant. Was justice served here? That depends, maybe, on what you think justice actually requires. Rachel never received an apology. Gregory never faced any consequence connected to what he said to her in 2010. Nothing about that deal, nothing about that meeting, had anything to do with it, legally or in any other sense. And yet, every time Hale Construction's finances are reviewed going forward, for as long as that partnership exists, the person doing at least part of that review is the same woman he once told, through a closed door, that she wasn't his problem anymore. So here's what we want to know. Do you think Rachel got the ending she deserved? Or do you think real justice would have required something more than this? Tell us in the comments, because we genuinely want to hear what you think.